Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're uncorking the story of a country that's been making wine longer than most civilizations have existed. We're heading to Georgia, not the American state with the peaches, but the original Georgia, nestled in the Caucasus Mountains, where Europe flirts shamelessly with Asia. This is a land where ancient traditions flow as freely as the wine from 8,000-year-old cellars, where medieval towers pierce mountain skies like stone exclamation points, and where the hospitality is so legendary that refusing a toast is practically considered a war crime. From the cobblestone streets of Tbilisi to the snow-capped peaks of Svaneti, Georgia has survived empires, revolutions, and even Soviet attempts to make their wine taste like industrial solvent. Drop a comment below telling us what you're sipping while you listen, and if it's Georgian wine, you're already ahead of the game. Hit that like button if you're ready for a journey through the world's most hospitable corner, and subscribe because trust me, every country has stories this good when you know where to look. Now, pour yourself something comfortable and let's discover why Georgia might just be the world's best kept secret. Chapter 1. Between Two Worlds. Picture, if you will, a country roughly the size of Ireland, squeezed between the towering peaks of the Greater Caucasus Mountains to the north and the Lesser Caucasus to the south. Georgia sits like a natural fortress at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, with the Black Sea lapping at its western shores and providing what ancient mariners must have considered the ultimate beach vacation destination. Assuming they didn't mind the occasional invasion from nomadic horsemen, this strategic location has been both Georgia's greatest blessing and its most persistent curse. Like a house built on a busy intersection, everyone wanted to drive through, and many decided they might as well stay for dinner and never leave. The geography itself reads like a divine practical joke, blessed with fertile valleys perfect for agriculture, mineral-rich mountains that would make any prospector weep with joy, and a climate so pleasant that grapes have been voluntarily turning themselves into wine here for over 8,000 years. The Greater Caucasus Mountains form Georgia's northern border with Russia, creating a natural wall that reaches heights of over 16,000 feet. Mount Shkara, Georgia's highest peak, stands like a stone sentinel, watching over the valleys below, probably wondering why humans insist on building civilizations in such complicated terrain. These mountains have served as both protection and prison throughout Georgian history, offering refuge from invaders, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible for Georgians to simply pack up and move somewhere less geopolitically interesting. To the south, the Lesser Caucasus Mountains create another formidable barrier, this time separating Georgia from Turkey and Armenia. Between these two mountain ranges lies a landscape so diverse it seems like nature was showing off. Subtropical coastlines along the Black Sea, alpine meadows that would make Swiss tourism boards jealous, semi-arid plains perfect for growing the grapes that would later become Georgia's liquid diplomacy, and forests so dense that even Google Earth probably gets confused trying to map them. The earliest inhabitants of this remarkable landscape arrived so long ago that archaeologists are still arguing about exactly when, though evidence suggests humans have been calling Georgia home for at least 1.8 million years. These early Georgians, known to science as Homo georgicus, were apparently the first Europeans, though they probably didn't spend much time worrying about their continental identity. They were too busy figuring out how to survive in a land where the weather could change from Mediterranean to Siberian, depending on which valley you happen to be standing in. Fast forward several 100,000 years, and we find the ancestors of modern Georgians developing some of the world's earliest agricultural societies. The fertile river valleys, particularly those of the Mount Kaveri and Rioni rivers, provided perfect conditions for farming, assuming farmers didn't mind the occasional flood, earthquake, or visit from unfriendly neighbors. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 6000 BCE, Georgian farmers were already cultivating grains, and more importantly, from a historical perspective, experimenting with grape cultivation. This early experimentation with viticulture would prove to be one of Georgia's most enduring contributions to world civilization. Georgian archaeologists, who must have the best job security in the world, given how much history is buried under Georgian soil, have discovered evidence of wine production dating back 8,000 years. Clay vessels called kvevri, used for fermenting and storing wine, have been found throughout the region, suggesting that ancient Georgians understood the fundamental truth that life is significantly more bearable with a good wine cellar. The ancient world knew Georgia primarily through the kingdom of Colchis, a realm that occupied much of western Georgia along the Black Sea coast. Colchis enters recorded history around the 8th century BCE, though like many ancient kingdoms, it probably existed long before anyone bothered to write anything down about it. The Greeks, ever eager to spin a good yarn, claimed that Colchis was the destination of Jason and his Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece. Now, before you dismiss this as purely mythological nonsense, though it certainly contains its fair share of that, consider the possibility that the Golden Fleece myth might have been based on actual Georgian gold mining techniques. Local rivers were indeed rich in gold, and Georgian miners developed a method of using sheep fleeces to trap gold particles from stream beds. When the fleeces were sufficiently loaded with gold, they would appear golden in sunlight. So Jason's quest might have been less about stealing a magical ram's coat, and more about industrial espionage in the ancient world's mining sector. Colchis became a significant player in Black Sea trade, exporting gold, silver, timber, and what the Greeks politely called exotic products, which probably included everything from honey to slaves to particularly attractive goats. The kingdom's wealth attracted attention from across the ancient world, which in those days was roughly equivalent to posting your vacation photos on social media and wondering why strangers keep showing up at your house. Greek colonies sprouted along the Georgian coast like ancient strip malls, bringing Hellenic culture, trade networks, and probably a fair amount of cultural confusion. Imagine trying to explain Greek democratic ideals to a society that had been successfully governed by kings for centuries, or attempting to introduce Olympic-style athletic competitions to people whose primary sport appeared to be surviving invasion attempts. The eastern regions of Georgia developed somewhat differently, forming the Kingdom of Kartli, also known as Iberia, not to be confused with the Iberian Peninsula, because ancient geographers apparently had limited imagination when it came to naming things. Kartli controlled the central and eastern portions of what would become modern Georgia, including the strategic Mount Kavari River Valley and the important trade routes connecting the Black Sea with Central Asia. While Colchis was busy trading with Greeks and dodging mythological heroes, Kartli found itself dealing with a succession of regional powers that viewed Georgian territory with the sort of covetous interest usually reserved for the last slice of pizza at a party. Persians, Romans, and various nomadic groups took turns attempting to incorporate Georgian lands into their respective empires, with varying degrees of success and staying power. The Persians proved particularly persistent, establishing periods of control that lasted long enough to influence Georgian culture, architecture, and administrative practices. Persian influence can still be seen in Georgian art and literature, though Georgians maintained their distinct cultural identity with the sort of stubborn determination that would become a national characteristic. It's rather like being forced to wear someone else's clothes while insisting on keeping your own hat. The influence is there, but so is the defiance. Roman interest in Georgia was primarily strategic, viewing the region as a buffer against Persian expansion and a source of military recruits known throughout the ancient world for their fighting ability. Georgian warriors developed a reputation for ferocity and loyalty that made them popular as mercenaries and bodyguards across the Mediterranean world. Apparently, Having your homeland constantly under threat of invasion provides excellent military training, though it's hardly a career path most people would choose voluntarily. The most transformative event in early Georgian history occurred in the 4th century CE, when King Mirian III of Kartli converted to Christianity, making Georgia one of the first nations to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. This conversion, traditionally dated to 337 CE, was attributed to the influence of Saint Nino, a Cappadocian woman who arrived in Georgia as either a slave or a missionary, depending on which version of the story you prefer. Saint Nino's evangelization of Georgia reads like a medieval adventure novel, complete with miraculous healings, royal conversions, and the sort of dramatic timing that makes historians wonder whether someone embellished the details in later retellings. According to Georgian Orthodox tradition, Nino cured Queen Nana of a mysterious illness that had left the royal physicians baffled, presumably because ancient Georgian medical training didn't cover divine intervention as a treatment option. King Mirian's conversion allegedly occurred during a hunting expedition, when he was struck blind and only regained his sight after praying to Nino's god. Whether this was divine intervention, a convenient coincidence, or the result of spending too much time staring at the sun while hunting, the king's conversion transformed Georgian society. Christianity provided not only spiritual guidance but also cultural connections with the Byzantine Empire and a written script that would preserve Georgian language and literature for future generations. The adoption of Christianity had profound implications for Georgian identity and international relations. Christian Georgia found itself ideologically aligned with Byzantium against Zoroastrian Persia, though this alliance proved about as reliable as medieval weather forecasting. The Byzantines were happy to support Georgian Christianity when it suited their strategic interests, but equally willing to abandon their Georgian allies when more pressing concerns arose elsewhere in their vast empire. Georgian Christianity developed its own distinctive characteristics, blending Orthodox doctrine with pre-Christian traditions in ways that would have made theologians nervous had they understood what was happening in remote mountain valleys. Local saints appeared who bore suspicious resemblances to ancient Georgian deities. Christian festivals coincided remarkably well with traditional agricultural celebrations, and Georgian churches developed architectural styles that incorporated elements of both Byzantine and Persian design. The establishment of monasteries throughout Georgia created centers of learning and cultural preservation that would prove crucial during subsequent periods of foreign occupation. These monastic communities became repositories of Georgian literature, art, and historical records, maintaining cultural continuity through centuries of political upheaval. Monks apparently understood that the best way to preserve civilization was to hide it in remote mountain monasteries, where invading armies couldn't be bothered to climb the steep paths. By the end of the 6th century, Georgia had established the cultural and religious foundations that would define its national identity for the next 1,500 years. Christianity provided spiritual unity, the Georgian alphabet preserved linguistic independence, and the mountainous geography offered refuge when political independence became temporarily impossible. These three elements, faith, language, and natural fortification, would prove to be Georgia's survival kit during the long centuries of foreign domination that lay ahead. As we prepare to explore Georgia's medieval golden age, it's worth noting that this early period established patterns that would recur throughout Georgian history: strategic geographic importance leading to foreign interest, successful cultural adaptation without complete assimilation, and the persistent Georgian ability to maintain distinct national identity regardless of which empire currently claimed political control. Like a particularly stubborn mountain flower that blooms despite harsh conditions, Georgia had learned to survive in its complicated corner of the world. The development of Georgian script deserves particular attention, as it represents one of humanity's more successful attempts at creating a writing system that actually works. The Georgian alphabet, known as Mukhedruli, evolved from earlier scripts and became standardized during the medieval period. Unlike some writing systems that seem designed to confuse future archaeologists, Georgian script proved remarkably practical and enduring. Each letter represents a single sound, making it refreshingly straightforward compared to languages that use the same symbol to represent 17 different sounds depending on the phase of the moon. This linguistic independence proved crucial for preserving Georgian culture during periods of foreign rule. When empires rise and fall, languages often disappear, along with political independence, but Georgian script allowed the preservation of religious texts, poetry, legal documents, and the sort of administrative records that make historians weep with joy centuries later. The fact that modern Georgians can still read medieval Georgian texts is roughly equivalent to Americans being able to understand Chaucer without a translation dictionary. Impressive and surprisingly useful. The early Georgian kingdoms also developed sophisticated administrative systems that would influence later political structures. The monarchy was supported by a complex network of nobles, regional governors, and military commanders who owed allegiance to the crown, while maintaining significant local autonomy. This feudal system, like most feudal systems, worked beautifully in theory and created entertaining political complications in practice. Balancing central authority with regional independence required the sort of diplomatic finesse usually associated with modern international relations, except with more swords and fewer lawyers. Trade networks during this early period extended far beyond Georgia's borders, connecting the kingdom with markets from Constantinople to Central Asia. Georgian merchants became familiar figures in Mediterranean ports and Asian trading posts, carrying not just goods but cultural influences that would enrich Georgian civilization. These trading relationships also meant that when empires elsewhere experienced economic troubles, Georgian merchants usually noticed the effects fairly quickly, providing an early warning system for political instability that modern intelligence agencies would envy. The stage was now set for the remarkable flowering of Georgian civilization that would emerge during the medieval period, when Georgian kings and queens would transform their mountainous kingdom into a major regional power, producing literature that would influence neighboring cultures and establishing a golden age that Georgians still remember with pride today. But that story belongs to our next chapter, where we'll discover how a small mountain kingdom managed to briefly become the most powerful state in the Caucasus. Chapter 2: Medieval Glory and Mongol Storms. As we settle deeper into the story of Georgia, we arrive at what historians universally agree was the nation's golden age, a period so magnificent that Georgians still measure everything against it, rather like how everyone compares modern movies to classics from the 1970s. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed Georgia transform from a mountainous kingdom into a regional superpower that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian, controlling trade routes that connected 3 continents and producing cultural achievements that would influence neighboring civilizations for centuries. At the heart of this golden age stands one of history's most remarkable rulers, Queen Tamar, known to her contemporaries as King Tamar, because the Georgian language apparently didn't have time for gender distinctions when it came to absolute authority. Tamar ruled from 1184 to 1213, presiding over Georgia's greatest territorial expansion and cultural flowering, with the sort of competence that made neighboring kings wonder whether they should consider abdicating in favor of someone more qualified. Tamar's path to the throne was hardly conventional for medieval Europe. Her father, George III, faced with the distinctly medieval problem of having no male heirs and a nephew whose political ambitions required surgical intervention, made the unprecedented decision to crown his 18-year-old daughter as co-ruler in 1178. This was roughly equivalent to announcing that a woman would captain a medieval football team. Theoretically possible, but likely to generate considerable discussion among the spectators. The Georgian aristocracy initially approached Tamar's rule with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for dental procedures. They insisted on a second coronation ceremony to legitimize her authority, demanded the removal of foreign advisors from court positions, and attempted to establish a noble council with the power to approve royal decisions. Tamar handled these challenges with diplomatic finesse that would have impressed modern negotiators, agreeing to the ceremonial demands while quietly outmaneuvering attempts to limit her actual authority. The noble's most intrusive intervention involved Tamar's first marriage, arranged to Prince Yuri of Novgorod, a Russian exile who possessed all the qualifications medieval aristocrats valued most: impressive military credentials, strategic alliance potential, and apparently no understanding whatsoever of Georgian politics. The marriage proved about as successful as most arranged unions between strong-willed monarchs and foreign princes, which is to say it lasted long enough for everyone to realize it was a terrible idea. Prince Yuri's interpretation of marriage apparently centered on the assumption that his wife would gratefully retire to domestic duties while he managed the important business of ruling her kingdom. This proved to be a fundamental misunderstanding of both Tamar's personality and Georgian political culture. After several years of escalating marital discord, Tamar divorced Yuri and banished him from the kingdom, demonstrating the sort of decisive leadership that would characterize her entire reign. Her second marriage to David Soslan, an Ossetian prince raised at the Georgian court, proved far more successful both personally and politically. David apparently understood that supporting Tamar's authority was considerably more beneficial than challenging it, becoming her most trusted military commander and the father of her children, while allowing his wife to maintain her position as Georgia's undisputed sovereign. Modern relationship counselors would probably cite this as an exemplary case study in successful partnership dynamics. Under Tamar's rule, Georgia achieved territorial expansion that transformed the kingdom into a Caucasian empire. Georgian armies campaigned successfully from the shores of the Black Sea to the mountains of Armenia, establishing protectorates over neighboring territories and creating a network of vassal states that acknowledged Georgian supremacy. The Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast was established with Georgian support, creating a strategic ally that controlled important maritime trade routes. These military successes were not merely conquests for territorial aggrandizement, but strategic moves that secured Georgia's borders and established economic prosperity through control of vital trade routes. Georgian merchants could now travel safely from Constantinople to Central Asia under the protection of Georgian arms, creating wealth that funded the cultural achievements for which Tamar's reign became famous. The royal treasury flourished to such an extent that contemporary chronicles describe the Queen's court as rivaling anything in Byzantium or Persia. The golden age of Georgian literature reached its apex during Tamar's reign, with the composition of The Knight in the Panther's Skin by Shota Rustaveli, a work so central to Georgian cultural identity that until the early 20th century, a copy formed part of every bride's dowry. This epic poem, consisting of over 1,600 quatrains, tells the story of friendship, love, and chivalric adventure, while serving as an allegorical celebration of Tamar's reign and Georgian values. Rustaveli himself remains a mysterious figure, known primarily through his literary work and a few tantalizing historical references. He may have served as Tamar's treasurer, though some scholars suspect this connection might be wishful thinking, by later Georgian patriots eager to establish a direct link between their greatest queen and their greatest poet. What we know with certainty is that Rustaveli created a masterpiece that influenced not only Georgian literature, but also the literary traditions of neighboring cultures. The poem's philosophical depth reflects the sophisticated intellectual culture of Tamar's court. Rustaveli championed ideals of gender equality, condemned forced marriages, and promoted concepts of courtly love that were remarkably progressive for the medieval period. His famous line, "The lion's whelps are equal, be they male or female," became a rallying cry for those who supported female sovereignty, providing literary justification for Tamar's unprecedented position as a ruling queen. The cultural renaissance extended far beyond literature to encompass architecture, religious art, and scholarly achievement. The Gelati monastery, founded by Tamar's great-grandfather David IV, became a centre of learning known throughout the medieval world as a new Hellas and a second Athos. The monastery's academy attracted scholars from across the Christian East, producing philosophical works, translations of classical texts, and scientific treatises that preserved and expanded human knowledge. Architecture during the Golden Age achieved a distinctly Georgian style that blended Byzantine sophistication with local innovations. The rock-hewn monastery complex of Vardzia, commissioned by Tamar herself, represents one of medieval architecture's most ambitious projects. Carved into a cliff face along the Kura River, Vardzia contained over 6,000 rooms arranged in up to 19 tiers, creating a fortified monastic city that could shelter thousands of people during times of conflict. The Church of the Dormition at Vardzia contains some of Georgia's most important medieval frescoes, including portraits of Tamar and her father George III holding a model of the church. These paintings, executed during the Queen's lifetime, provide the earliest known depiction of the legendary ruler and demonstrate the sophisticated artistic techniques developed by Georgian painters who successfully integrated Byzantine traditions with indigenous styles. Georgia's prosperity during this period was reflected in the elaborate royal title that Tamar assumed. King of Kings and Queen of Queens of the Abkhazians, Kartvalians, Iranians, Kakhetians, Armenians, Shivanshah, and Shahanshah, autocrat of all the East and the West, glory of the world and faith, champion of Jesus, the Saviour and Messiah. While this might seem excessive by modern standards, it accurately described the extent of Georgian influence during the kingdom's territorial zenith. The Golden Age also witnessed significant legal and administrative reforms. Tamar abolished her father's harsh criminal penalties, banned torture and the death penalty, and established a more humane judicial system that reflected Christian principles of mercy and redemption. These reforms were not merely expressions of personal compassion, but strategic policies that strengthened royal authority by demonstrating that effective leadership didn't require brutal repression. Religious tolerance, a hallmark of Tamar's reign, contributed to Georgia's stability and prosperity. While Christianity remained the state religion, the Queen protected the rights of Muslim and Jewish populations, understanding that economic prosperity depended on the participation of all productive members of society. This enlightened approach to religious diversity was unusual in medieval Europe and demonstrated Georgian political sophistication. The economic foundation of Georgia's Golden Age rested on the kingdom's strategic position along major trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Georgian merchants established trading posts from the Byzantine Empire to Central Asia, while foreign traders contributed to the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Georgian cities. The famous Silk Road passed through Georgian territory, bringing not only wealth but also cultural exchange that enriched Georgian civilization. Agricultural innovations during this period increased food production and supported population growth. Georgian farmers developed sophisticated irrigation systems, expanded viticulture, and introduced new crops that diversified agricultural output. The famous Georgian wine industry, already ancient by Tamar's time, reached new heights of sophistication as royal patronage encouraged experimentation with grape varieties and production techniques. However, the very success of Tamar's Georgia contained the seeds of future vulnerability. The kingdom's wealth and strategic position inevitably attracted the attention of ambitious neighbours. while internal success may have bred a certain complacency about external threats. The Georgian army, triumphant in numerous campaigns against regional opponents, had yet to face an enemy capable of challenging the kingdom's fundamental existence. Tamar died in 1213, leaving behind a transformed Georgia that had achieved unprecedented power and cultural sophistication. Her son, George IV, inherited a kingdom that seemed destined for continued greatness, with secure borders, a thriving economy, and cultural achievements that commanded respect throughout the medieval world. Unfortunately, he also inherited a geopolitical situation that was about to become significantly more complicated. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, had spent the early 13th century systematically destroying the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia with the sort of thoroughness that made medieval chroniclers struggle to find adequate metaphors for the devastation. Georgian rulers, focused on their regional concerns, may not have fully appreciated the implications of distant events in Persia and Central Asia, though rumours of vast armies and unprecedented destruction must have reached the royal court. The first Mongol appearance in the Caucasus came in 1220, as generals Subutai and Jebei pursued the fleeing Khwarezmian, Shah Muhammad II through Persia and into Georgian territory. This initial encounter was not a planned invasion, but rather the consequence of the Mongols' relentless pursuit of their primary target. However, when Georgian forces attempted to block their passage, the result demonstrated the gulf between regional military excellence and world-conquering capability. At the Battle of Kunan, approximately 20,000 Mongol cavalry encountered a Georgian army led by King George IV and his military commander Ivane Mkhagradzeili. The Georgian force, representing the cream of the kingdom's military establishment, employed traditional heavy cavalry tactics that had proven successful against regional opponents for decades. The result was a decisive Mongol victory that shattered Georgian confidence and left King George severely wounded. The Mongols returned in 1221 for a second encounter at Bardav, where they again overwhelmed Georgian forces with tactical innovations that Georgian commanders had never encountered. Mongol horse archers, organized in decimal units and employing coordinated battlefield tactics developed over decades of steppe warfare, simply outmaneuvered and outfought the Georgian heavy cavalry. These defeats revealed that Georgia's military supremacy was limited to conflicts with similarly equipped regional opponents. After these initial raids, the Mongols withdrew to pursue other objectives, leaving Georgia to contemplate the implications of these devastating encounters. The psychological impact was perhaps greater than the immediate military damage. Georgia had discovered that its Golden Age military machine was inadequate against truly formidable opponents. The kingdom that had seemed invincible against regional rivals now faced the reality that distant events could produce existential threats. Between 1225 and 1231, Georgia faced additional challenges from Jalal al-Din Mangburni, the son of the last Khwarezmian Shah, who attempted to rebuild his father's empire by conquering territories throughout the region. His forces captured Tbilisi in 1226, dealing another severe blow to Georgian prestige and further weakening the kingdom's defensive capabilities. These conflicts depleted Georgia's resources and military strength just when they would be most needed. The final Mongol invasion began in 1236, under the command of General Kormakhan, who led a systematic conquest of the Caucasus that reduced Georgia from an imperial power to a vassal state. This campaign was not a pursuit raid, but a deliberate effort to incorporate Georgian territories into the expanding Mongol Empire. Most Georgian nobles, recognizing the futility of resistance after previous military disasters, submitted without serious opposition. Queen Rusudan, Tamar's daughter who had inherited the throne after her brother George's death, found herself negotiating submission to Mongol overlords who demanded tribute, hostages, and military service from their new vassals. The golden age that had seemed so permanent and secure ended within 2 decades of Tamar's death, transformed into a memory that would inspire Georgian resistance and cultural preservation for centuries to come. The contrast between Georgia's golden age achievements and the speed of their collapse provides a sobering lesson about the fragility of medieval political success. The same geographic position that facilitated trade and prosperity also made Georgia vulnerable to conquest by superior military forces. The cultural achievements of Tamar's reign, however, proved more durable than political independence, preserving Georgian identity through centuries of foreign domination that lay ahead. Chapter 3: The Russian Embrace. By the late 18th century, Georgia found itself in the unenviable position of a small kingdom surrounded by much larger empires, all of whom viewed Georgian independence with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for rival football teams entering their territory. The Mongol devastation had long since faded into historical memory, but new threats had emerged to fill the vacuum. The Ottoman Empire controlled western Georgian territories, Persia maintained claims over eastern regions, and various Caucasian tribes conducted regular raids that made peaceful agriculture roughly as feasible as underwater basket weaving. King Heraclius, the second of the eastern Georgian kingdom of Kakheti, faced a strategic dilemma that would have challenged even modern diplomatic experts: how to maintain independence while surrounded by empires that could crush his small kingdom without significantly disrupting their breakfast schedules. The Persian Empire under Nader Shah had repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to devastate Georgian lands when local rulers proved insufficiently submissive, while Ottoman forces threatened from the west with equally destructive intentions. Into this complex geopolitical situation came an unexpected option: alliance with the Russian Empire, an Orthodox Christian state that had been steadily expanding southward from its territories beyond the Caucasus Mountains. Russian expansion into the region was driven partly by strategic concerns about controlling trade routes, and partly by a desire to protect Orthodox Christians from Muslim rulers, though cynics might suggest that imperial expansion rarely requires extensive theological justification. The idea of Russian protection wasn't entirely novel in Georgian political thinking. Previous Georgian rulers had occasionally sought Russian assistance during particularly difficult periods, though such appeals usually resulted in expressions of sympathy rather than actual military support. However, by the 1770s, Russian power had grown sufficiently that promises of protection carried considerably more weight than sympathetic letters from distant monarchs. The precipitating crisis came with Persia's renewed efforts to reassert control over Georgian territories. Aga Muhammad Khan, founder of the Qajar dynasty, had spent the 1790s consolidating his power in Persia and was now turning his attention to rebellious vassals who had grown too independent during periods of Persian weakness. His approach to diplomatic relations apparently involved the same subtlety that modern debt collectors might employ, except with considerably more fire and considerably fewer legal constraints. Faced with the prospect of devastating Persian invasion, King Heraclius made the fateful decision to formalize Georgia's relationship with Russia through a comprehensive treaty. The negotiations took place in 1783, with Georgian representatives travelling to the fortress of Georgievsk in the North Caucasus to meet with Russian officials. The location was symbolic. Georgian diplomats were literally crossing into Russian-controlled territory to negotiate their kingdom's future. The Treaty of Georgievsk, signed on July 24, 1783, established Georgia as a Russian protectorate, while theoretically preserving Georgian autonomy and the Bagrationi dynasty's right to rule. The agreement seemed like an ideal solution to Georgia's security problems: Russian military protection in exchange for foreign policy coordination, with internal affairs remaining under Georgian control. Catherine the Great's representatives promised to defend Georgian territories and preserve the kingdom's traditional rights and privileges. The treaty's terms appeared generous to Georgian negotiators who were presumably comparing them to the alternative of Persian conquest and potential deportation. Russia guaranteed Georgia's territorial integrity, promised to maintain the Bagrationi dynasty on the throne, and pledged to respect Georgian Orthodox Christianity and traditional laws. In return, Georgia would coordinate its foreign policy with Russian interests and provide military support when requested, which seemed like a reasonable price for avoiding annihilation. However, the treaty's effectiveness proved roughly equivalent to an umbrella made of tissue paper during a thunderstorm. When Aga Muhammad Khan launched his threatened invasion in 1795, Russian assistance materialized with all the speed and reliability of medieval postal service. Persian forces captured and sacked Tbilisi, massacring thousands of inhabitants, while Russian armies remained conspicuously absent from the battlefield. The Battle of Khrytsanisi in 1795 demonstrated the gap between Russian promises and Russian performance in spectacularly devastating fashion. Georgian forces, expecting Russian support, found themselves facing the Persian army alone and suffered a catastrophic defeat that left the kingdom's military power shattered and its capital city in ruins. King Heraclius reportedly spent his final years wondering whether Russian protection might be slightly less reliable than protection from mythical creatures. Catherine the Great eventually did declare war on Persia and dispatched an army southward, but her convenient death in 1796 ended this military expedition before it could accomplish anything useful for the Georgians. Her successor, Paul I, had different strategic priorities that apparently didn't include rescuing distant Orthodox Christians from Persian revenge, leaving Georgia to cope with the consequences of its Russian alliance without meaningful Russian assistance. The situation deteriorated further after King Heraclius died in 1798, leaving the throne to his son George XII, whose political skills were roughly adequate for managing a provincial estate, but somewhat insufficient for navigating the complexities of Caucasian geopolitics. George's reign was brief and troubled, marked by succession disputes and continued Persian threats that made effective governance approximately as feasible as conducting orchestra concerts during artillery bombardments. When George XII died in 1800, the succession crisis provided Russian officials with an opportunity to solve their Georgian problem once and for all. Rather than supporting one of the rival claimants to the throne, Tsar Paul I decided that the most effective way to protect Georgia was to eliminate the kingdom entirely. On January 18, 1801, he signed a manifesto annexing Kartli Kakheti directly into the Russian Empire. This annexation was justified as necessary for Georgian security, though Georgians might have reasonably pointed out that being conquered by one's protector represented a somewhat unconventional interpretation of defensive alliance. Russian officials explained that the Bagrationi dynasty had proven unable to provide effective governance, which was rather like criticizing someone's driving skills after confiscating their car keys and stealing their vehicle. The implementation of Russian rule proved about as popular with Georgians as most foreign occupations tend to be. General Karl Heinrich von Noring arrived to establish Russian administration with the diplomatic sensitivity of a medieval tax collector. He forcibly removed the Georgian royal family, installed Russian officials in administrative positions, and compelled the Georgian nobility to swear loyalty oaths to the Russian crown in Tbilisi's cathedral under military guard. Those Georgian nobles who hesitated to embrace their new Russian overlords discovered that resistance was met with arrest and exile, which provided a compelling incentive for political cooperation. The ceremony in Sioni Cathedral, where Georgian aristocrats were surrounded by Russian soldiers while swearing fealty to the Tsar, symbolized the transformation of Georgia from protected ally to conquered province with remarkable clarity. The early decades of Russian rule were characterized by the sort of administrative efficiency that colonial powers typically bring to newly acquired territories. Systematic exploitation combined with casual disregard for local customs and preferences. Russian officials treated Georgia as a frontier region suitable for resource extraction and military recruitment, while Georgian complaints about treaty violations were handled with the attention typically given to weather reports from distant planets. However, Russian rule also brought certain practical benefits that even Georgian patriots had to acknowledge. The constant threat of Persian and Turkish invasion finally ended, allowing agricultural and commercial development that had been impossible during centuries of intermittent warfare. The construction of the Georgian military road connecting Tbilisi to Russia proper facilitated trade and communication, while Russian investment in infrastructure gradually modernized the Georgian economy. The abolition of serfdom in the Georgian provinces during the 1860s represented one of Russian rule's more progressive achievements, though the implementation was complicated by the need to balance peasant liberation with maintaining noble loyalty. Georgian serfs gained personal freedom and land rights, while former masters received compensation that softened the economic impact of emancipation. The process was imperfect and gradual, but it eliminated an institution that had perpetuated rural poverty for centuries. More significantly for Georgian national identity, Russian rule inadvertently fostered the development of modern Georgian nationalism through the very policies designed to integrate Georgia into the empire. Russian education, intended to create loyal imperial citizens, instead produced a generation of Georgian intellectuals who used their Russian-acquired knowledge to articulate distinctly Georgian cultural and political aspirations. The emergence of the Turgdaluli movement in the mid-19th century exemplified this paradoxical development. These were Georgian intellectuals who had received their education in Russian universities and returned home with both Russian learning and strengthened Georgian identity. Their name literally meant those who had drunk the water of the Turgi River, a reference to their journey through Russian territories, but their mission was fundamentally about preserving and revitalizing Georgian culture. Ilya Chavchavadze emerged as the most influential figure in this cultural renaissance, earning recognition as the father of Georgian nationalism through his literary works, journalism, and educational activities. His writings combined social criticism with passionate advocacy for Georgian language and culture, while his practical efforts included founding newspapers and supporting educational institutions that promoted Georgian literacy and identity. Chavchavadze's famous short story, Is That a Human Being?, attacked the moral corruption of the Georgian nobility while advocating for social reform and national awakening. His journalism addressed contemporary political and social issues with a directness that frequently attracted Russian official attention, though his reputation protected him from the sort of administrative enthusiasm that less prominent dissidents might have experienced. Kakheti Tsereteli contributed to this cultural revival through poetry that expressed both love for the Georgian homeland and criticism of social injustice. His lyrical works often focused on the lives of ordinary Georgians, celebrating folk traditions while advocating for social and political reform. Many of his poems were set to music and became part of Georgia's cultural patrimony, creating a shared artistic heritage that strengthened national consciousness. The Georgian Literacy Society, founded by these intellectuals, became the institutional center of the national revival movement. The society's ostensible purpose was promoting literacy and education in the Georgian language, but its actual function was considerably broader, creating a network of cultural institutions that preserved Georgian identity while operating within the constraints of Russian imperial rule. This organization established libraries, schools, and publications that served as vehicles for Georgian cultural expression while avoiding direct political confrontation with Russian authorities. The society's activities included collecting and publishing Georgian folklore, supporting Georgian language literature, and promoting traditional arts and crafts that might otherwise have disappeared under the pressure of Russification. The development of Georgian theatre during this period provided another outlet for national expression that managed to avoid excessive official scrutiny. Theatrical productions could address social and political themes through historical allegory or folkloric adaptation, allowing audiences to experience Georgian cultural identity while maintaining the fiction that performances were merely entertainment rather than political activity. Georgian journalism also flourished during the latter half of the 19th century, though newspapers had to navigate between promoting Georgian interests and avoiding content that might provoke Russian censorship. Publications like Iveria provided forums for discussing Georgian cultural and social issues, while carefully avoiding direct criticism of imperial policies that might result in closure or prosecution. The economic development that accompanied Russian rule created new opportunities for Georgian cultural expression through the emergence of an urban merchant class, with both the resources and the inclination to support literary and artistic activities. Tbilisi grew into a major regional centre with a cosmopolitan population that included not only Georgians and Russians but also Armenians, Jews, and other ethnic groups who contributed to the city's intellectual ferment. This urban environment fostered Georgian educational institutions that combined Russian curriculum requirements with Georgian cultural content. Students learned Russian language and literature as required by imperial policies, but they also studied Georgian history and literature in ways that strengthened their Georgian identity. The Transcaucasian Railway construction in the 1870s connected Georgia to Russian markets and European ideas, facilitating economic development while exposing Georgian intellectuals to European nationalist movements. Railroad stations became symbols of modernity while serving as conduits for ideas that would challenge Russian imperial control. By the 19th century's end, Georgia had developed modern national consciousness, combining traditional culture with political aspirations. Russian policies designed to integrate the region actually strengthened Georgian distinctiveness. Educational opportunities created intellectuals who articulated national aspirations, while economic development provided resources for cultural activities. As the 19th century ended, Georgia remained under Russian control, but foundations were laid for independence movements that would emerge during 20th century revolutionary upheavals. The Cultural Renaissance had created modern Georgian national identity that would prove remarkably resilient, demonstrating that attempts to eliminate national consciousness through assimilation often achieve precisely the opposite result. Chapter 4: Revolution, Soviet Rule, and Stalin's Shadow. The year 1917 arrived in Georgia like a breath of fresh air through a window that had been sealed shut for over a century. The Russian Revolution had shattered the imperial system that had governed Georgian life since annexation, creating opportunities for national self-determination that would have been inconceivable just months earlier. For Georgian intellectuals who had spent decades advocating cultural autonomy within Russian structures, the collapse of Tsarist authority offered possibilities they had scarcely dared to imagine. The February Revolution that toppled Tsar Nicholas II created immediate confusion throughout the former Russian Empire, but in Georgia it also sparked hope that exceeded the wildest dreams of 19th century nationalists. The provisional government that assumed power in Petersburg showed little interest in maintaining firm control over distant Caucasian territories, leaving Georgian political leaders with unprecedented freedom to determine their own administrative arrangements. Georgian Social Democrats, who had dominated local politics since the 1905 revolution, found themselves in the unexpected position of managing what amounted to de facto independence before they had formally declared it. These Menshevik politicians had spent their careers advocating gradual democratic reform within a broader Russian framework, but now faced the necessity of creating entirely new governmental structures for a territory that had never existed as an independent modern state. The Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, formed in April 1918 as a union of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, represented an admirable attempt at regional cooperation that lasted approximately as long as most New Year's resolutions. The federation collapsed within weeks due to fundamental disagreements about foreign policy, ethnic tensions, and the practical difficulties of governing three distinct nations with competing territorial claims and conflicting strategic interests. On May 26, 1918, Georgia declared independence, establishing the Democratic Republic of Georgia under Menshevik leadership. The timing was hardly auspicious. World War I was still raging. The Russian Civil War was spreading chaos across the former empire, and Georgia found itself surrounded by hostile or unstable neighbours with very different ideas about territorial boundaries and political legitimacy. The new Georgian government faced challenges that would have daunted even experienced statesmen, which the Menshevik leaders decidedly were not. They had to create military forces from scratch, establish international diplomatic relations, design economic policies for a war-torn region, and somehow maintain domestic order while Turkish and German armies manoeuvred nearby with objectives that rarely included Georgian territorial integrity. Despite these daunting circumstances, the Democratic Republic achieved remarkable success in establishing functional democratic institutions. The government organized free elections in February 1919, created a multi-party parliament, established an independent judiciary, and implemented social reforms that were progressive by any international standard. Women received voting rights ahead of many European countries, while labour laws protected worker organisation and guaranteed the right to strike. The land reform programme implemented by the Menshevik government redistributed over 400,000 hectares to small farmers without triggering the rural violence that plagued Bolshevik Russia during the same period. Georgian landowners, perhaps recognizing the alternatives visible across the border, accepted compensation-based redistribution with remarkably little resistance, demonstrating the sort of pragmatic flexibility that characterized Georgian political culture. Economically, the Republic managed to maintain relative stability despite the disruptions of war and revolution. Trade relationships with European partners provided access to international markets, while domestic production avoided the catastrophic declines that characterized Bolshevik territories. The Georgian currency remained stable, food supplies were adequate, and industrial production actually increased in some sectors. However, the Democratic Republic's greatest achievement was also the source of its ultimate vulnerability, the creation of genuine popular government that commanded widespread citizen loyalty. Unlike the Bolshevik system emerging in Russia, Georgian democracy was not imposed by revolutionary vanguard but developed through electoral processes that reflected authentic public preferences. This legitimacy would later complicate Soviet efforts to establish control. The Republic's international recognition was extensive by standards of the revolutionary period. Major European powers, the United States, and even Soviet Russia formally acknowledged Georgian independence through diplomatic recognition and treaty agreements. The Treaty of Moscow, signed in May 1920, established normal relations between Soviet Russia and Georgia, with Lenin's government explicitly recognizing Georgian sovereignty. This recognition would prove meaningless when strategic considerations shifted in Moscow's favor. Soviet foreign policy during the Civil War period was notably flexible regarding questions of national self-determination, but flexibility in international relations often indicates temporary convenience rather than permanent principle. As Bolshevik control consolidated within Russia proper, autonomous border republics began to appear less like desirable allies and more like unnecessary complications. The invasion of Georgia began on February 11th, 1921, orchestrated primarily by Joseph Stalin and Sergei Orjonikidze, both Georgian Bolsheviks who had spent their political careers outside Georgia and possessed limited understanding of current conditions within their homeland. The pretext was support for a supposedly spontaneous uprising in border regions, though subsequent investigation revealed this uprising to be about as spontaneous as most Soviet political developments. The Georgian army, despite heroic resistance, proved no match for the Red Army forces that crossed the border with overwhelming numerical superiority and modern equipment. The Democratic Republic's military had been designed for border security and maintaining domestic order, not for defending against full-scale invasion by a major power. Within weeks, Soviet forces had occupied Tbilisi and established a revolutionary committee to govern the conquered territory. The Menshevik government retreated westward, hoping for assistance from French naval forces stationed in the Black Sea, but European powers proved as reluctant to defend Georgian democracy as they had been to defend Czech democracy 20 years later. The French squadron fired warning shots but declined to land troops or provide meaningful military support, leaving Georgian forces to face Soviet occupation without external assistance. The transition from independence to Soviet rule was traumatic for a population that had experienced 3 years of democratic government and economic recovery. The Bolshevik administration that assumed control enjoyed virtually no popular support, recruiting fewer than 10,000 Georgian members during its first 3 years, while the banned Menshevik Party maintained over 60,000 underground adherents who remembered the recent experience of legitimate governance. Georgian resistance to Soviet rule culminated in the August Uprising of 1924, a desperate attempt to restore independence that demonstrated both the depth of anti-Soviet feeling and the futility of resistance against overwhelming military force. The uprising was brutally suppressed, with thousands of participants executed and many more deported to Central Asian exile. This crushing defeat eliminated the active core of Georgian resistance and established the pattern of Soviet control that would persist for 70 years. The suppression of the 1924 uprising marked the end of organized resistance to Soviet rule, but it also created an enduring legacy of martyrdom that would influence Georgian political consciousness for generations. The rebel leader Kakheti Cholokashvili became a symbol of national resistance, while the thousands who died fighting Soviet forces were remembered as heroes who had defended Georgian freedom against impossible odds. Soviet Georgia was initially incorporated into the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic alongside Armenia and Azerbaijan, an administrative arrangement that reflected Moscow's desire to prevent the development of strong national identity in any single Caucasian republic. This federal structure was designed to encourage ethnic minorities within each republic to look to Moscow for protection against their respective local majorities, creating divided loyalties that strengthened central control. The most peculiar aspect of Soviet Georgia's early history was the role of Joseph Stalin, who had emerged as Lenin's successor and was steadily consolidating power throughout the Soviet Union. Stalin's Georgian origins created complex dynamics within Soviet nationality policy, as the dictator seemed determined to prove that ethnic background would not influence his loyalty to Soviet internationalism. This demonstration frequently involved being particularly harsh toward his homeland. Stalin's attitude toward Georgia resembled that of an ambitious immigrant who insists on being more patriotically American than natives born in the country. He promoted Russian language and culture throughout the Soviet Union, while suppressing expressions of Georgian nationalism with special vigor, apparently concerned that any favoritism toward Georgia might be interpreted as evidence of provincial bias rather than true Soviet loyalty. The collectivization of Georgian agriculture during the 1930s proceeded with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized the process throughout the Soviet Union, though Georgian peasants had somewhat less experience with communal farming traditions that might have eased the transition. Wine production, Georgia's most distinctive agricultural specialty, was reorganized into state farms that emphasized quantity over quality, transforming what had been artisanal craft into industrial process. The purges of the 1930s struck Georgian intellectual and political elites with devastating force. Anyone who had participated in the Democratic Republic, supported Menshevik policies, or maintained connections with Western culture became suspect. The Georgian Orthodox Church, which had regained independence during the brief Republican period, found itself subjected to systematic persecution that closed monasteries and imprisoned clergy. Paradoxically, Stalin's position as Soviet leader also provided certain benefits for Georgia that other republics did not enjoy. Investment in Georgian industry and infrastructure was substantial, while Georgian officials occupied prominent positions throughout the Soviet bureaucracy. The capital, Tbilisi, was developed into a major regional center with universities, theaters, and cultural institutions that served the entire Caucasus region. World War II brought massive disruption to Georgia, though the region never experienced direct military occupation by Axis forces. Soviet Georgia contributed approximately 700,000 soldiers to the Red Army, with over 300,000 killed in combat, a casualty rate that reflected both Georgian military traditions and the devastating nature of the Eastern Front campaigns. The war also produced the curious phenomenon of the Georgian Legion, formed by Georgian emigrants and prisoners of war who chose to fight for Germany in hopes of achieving Georgian independence. This collaboration with Nazi forces was motivated less by ideological sympathy than by calculation that German victory might offer the only realistic path to overthrowing Soviet rule. The legions ultimately fought in Holland and other Western European theatres, far from their homeland. Meanwhile, Georgia itself became a crucial supplier of war materials to the Soviet effort. Georgian factories produced aircraft, textiles, and weapons, while Georgian manganese mines provided essential materials for steel production. The Republic's industrial capacity, developed during the Soviet period, proved vital for sustaining the war effort during the darkest period of the conflict. The peculiar irony of Stalin's relationship with Georgia became most apparent during his final years when he ordered the deportation of several Caucasian ethnic groups accused of collaboration with the Germans. Chechens, Ingush, and other peoples were forcibly relocated to Central Asia under conditions that resulted in massive mortality, while their lands were redistributed to other Soviet citizens. These deportations were planned and executed with the sort of bureaucratic precision that reflected decades of experience in population management. Stalin's death in March 1953 triggered an unexpected crisis in Georgia when students at Tbilisi University organized demonstrations protesting Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies. The March 9th, 1956 riots reflected the complex emotions many Georgians felt about their most famous native son. Pride that a Georgian had achieved ultimate power in the Soviet system, combined with resentment about the suffering he had inflicted on his homeland. The Soviet forces that suppressed these demonstrations killed approximately 100 Georgian students, creating new martyrs for Georgian nationalism, while demonstrating that Moscow would not tolerate expressions of ethnic pride that challenged party orthodoxy. The brutal suppression of these protests also revealed the continuing strength of Georgian national feeling, despite decades of Soviet rule and indoctrination. The post-Stalin period in Georgia was characterized by the gradual development of what scholars later termed Soviet Georgian identity, a complex blend of loyalty to socialist ideals with pride in Georgian cultural distinctiveness. This synthesis allowed Georgians to participate fully in Soviet institutions while maintaining elements of national consciousness that would prove crucial during the independence movement of the 1980s. Georgian Communist Party leaders during this period mastered the art of expressing Georgian interests in terms that Moscow could accept. Investment in Georgian cultural institutions, promotion of Georgian language education, and celebration of Georgian historical achievements were justified as examples of Soviet nationality policy rather than expressions of separatist sentiment, creating space for cultural preservation within officially internationalist frameworks. By the end of the Stalin era, Georgia had been thoroughly integrated into the Soviet system, while paradoxically maintaining stronger national identity than many other Soviet republics. The memory of the Democratic Republic, though officially suppressed, survived in family narratives and cultural traditions that would later provide foundation for the independence movement that finally emerged during the glasnost period of the 1980s. Chapter 5: Independence, Dreams and Civil Strife. The 1980s arrived in Soviet Georgia like spring after a particularly harsh winter, bringing winds of change that would ultimately transform not only Georgia but the entire Soviet system. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika created unprecedented opportunities for expression of national identity and political dissent, allowing Georgians to voice aspirations that had been suppressed since the 1920s. For the first time in decades, public discussion of Georgian independence became possible without immediate arrest and deportation to Siberian labor camps. The catalyst for Georgian independence movements came from an unlikely source, a linguistic dispute that escalated into a mass protest movement powerful enough to challenge Soviet authority. In early 1989, rumors spread that Russian might become Georgia's official language, triggering demonstrations that tapped into decades of accumulated resentment about cultural suppression and political subordination. What began as a protest about language policy quickly became a broader movement for national self-determination. The April 9, 1989 demonstration in Tbilisi drew hundreds of thousands of Georgians demanding independence from the Soviet Union, creating scenes that resembled a national festival more than a political protest. Families brought picnic lunches, musicians performed patriotic songs, and speakers addressed the crowd in Georgian without fear of official retribution. The atmosphere was euphoric, with participants sensing they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in Georgian history. However, the Soviet response demonstrated that glasnost had definite limits when it came to challenges to territorial integrity. On the night of April 9th, Soviet paratroopers moved against the peaceful demonstrators using chemical weapons and sharpened shovels, killing 20 people and injuring hundreds more. This brutality, shocking even by Soviet standards, galvanized Georgian opinion and made compromise with Moscow virtually impossible. The massacre of April 9th created martyrs for the independence movement, while revealing the moral bankruptcy of Soviet rule in Georgia. The victims included teenage girls and elderly women who had committed no crime other than peacefully expressing their desire for national self-determination. Their deaths transformed what might have remained a gradual political evolution into an urgent demand for immediate independence. Sviat Gamsakhurdia emerged as the leading voice of Georgian nationalism following the April tragedy. A former political prisoner and the son of a famous Georgian writer, Gamsakhurdia possessed the moral authority and rhetorical skill necessary to channel popular outrage into effective political action. His message of Georgian cultural superiority and historical destiny resonated powerfully with audiences who had endured decades of forced integration into Russian-dominated structures. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided the opportunity Georgians had been seeking since the 1920s. On April 9, 1991, the second anniversary of the massacre, Georgia declared independence, with Gamsa Kurdia becoming the republic's first democratically elected president. The symbolism was powerful. Georgia was reclaiming its freedom on the anniversary of Soviet brutality, demonstrating that oppression ultimately strengthens rather than weakens the desire for liberty. Unfortunately, independence brought challenges that were considerably more complex than resisting Soviet rule. Georgia's borders contained substantial ethnic minorities who viewed Georgian nationalism with the same suspicion that Georgians had felt toward Russian nationalism. South Ossetians and Abkhazians, who had enjoyed autonomous status within the Soviet system, feared that independent Georgia would pursue assimilationist policies that would threaten their distinct cultural identities. Gamsa Kurdia's presidency, despite its popular mandate, proved disastrously unsuited to managing these ethnic complexities. His rhetoric about Georgia for the Georgians, combined with policies that appeared to marginalize minority rights, convinced South Ossetians and Abkhazians that their survival as distinct communities required resistance to Georgian central authority. What might have been resolved through inclusive constitutional arrangements became violent conflicts that would plague Georgia for decades. The South Ossetian conflict erupted in 1990, when the region declared independence in response to Georgian policies that abolished its autonomous status. The resulting war displaced thousands of civilians and demonstrated that Georgian independence would not automatically solve the country's political problems. Ethnic warfare is particularly destructive because it attacks people for characteristics they cannot change, creating hatreds that persist long after political grievances might be resolved. Meanwhile, Gamsa Kurdia's authoritarian tendencies alienated even Georgian supporters who had initially welcomed his leadership. His government arrested opposition politicians, restricted press freedom, and concentrated power in ways that reminded critics of Soviet practices under Georgian leadership. By late 1991, significant portions of the Georgian political elite had concluded that Gamsa Kurdia represented a threat to democracy rather than its champion. The Georgian Civil War began in December 1991, when opposition forces launched a coup against Gamsa Kurdia's government, triggering street fighting in Tbilisi that left the capital in ruins and the country divided between competing factions. The irony was profound. Georgia had gained independence from authoritarian rule only to descend into civil conflict between different groups of Georgians who disagreed about how independence should be implemented. Eduard Shevardnadze's return to Georgian politics in 1992 represented an attempt to restore stability through experienced leadership, though his Soviet-era background made him an unlikely champion of democratic governance. Shevardnadze had served as Gorbachev's foreign minister and possessed international credibility that Georgia desperately needed, but his appointment also suggested that independence had failed to create genuinely new political alternatives. The Abkhazian War that erupted in 1992 was even more devastating than the South Ossetian conflict, ultimately resulting in the ethnic cleansing of over 200,000 ethnic Georgians from territory they had inhabited for generations. The war's brutality shocked international observers and demonstrated that post-Soviet conflicts could achieve levels of savagery comparable to the worst ethnic conflicts anywhere in the world. Russian involvement in both conflicts was decisive but officially denied, following the pattern that would later characterize Russian interventions in other former Soviet territories. Russian military advisors, weapons, and volunteers supported separatist forces, while Moscow officially maintained neutrality, creating plausible deniability, while ensuring that Georgian central authority could not establish control over rebellious regions. The 1990s in Georgia were characterized by state collapse so complete that many observers questioned whether the country could survive as a functioning political entity. Government revenues virtually disappeared, public services ceased functioning, and criminal gangs controlled significant portions of the country. Citizens joked bitterly that independence had brought them the freedom to freeze in the dark, while corrupt officials stole everything that wasn't permanently attached to the ground. Shevardnadze's presidency gradually stabilized the country's immediate security situation, while allowing corruption to flourish on a scale that would have impressed medieval tax collectors. The president himself maintained a reputation for personal honesty, but his government became synonymous with a system where every official transaction required unofficial payments, and every public position was treated as a private business opportunity. By the early 2000s, Georgian frustration with perpetual crisis and systemic corruption created conditions for another revolutionary upheaval. The difference was that this revolution would be led not by nationalist intellectuals but by Western-educated politicians who promised to transform Georgia into a modern European democracy. Their leader was Mikhail Saakashvili, a Columbia Law School graduate whose energy and ambition exceeded anything Georgian politics had previously experienced. The Rose Revolution of November 2003 was triggered by parliamentary elections that featured the sort of fraud that had become routine in Georgian politics, but this time opposition forces were prepared to challenge the results through sustained civil disobedience. The revolution's name came from the red roses that protesters carried as they stormed the parliament building, symbolizing their commitment to peaceful change despite their determination to overthrow the government. The success of the Rose Revolution demonstrated the power of non-violent resistance when combined with effective organization and international support. The youth movement Kamara, inspired by Serbia's successful opposition to Slobodan Milosevic, mobilized thousands of young Georgians who were tired of living in a failed state. Independent television, particularly Rustavi 2, provided a platform for opposition voices that government censors had previously suppressed. Saakashvili's presidency, beginning in 2004, brought dramatic changes to Georgian governance, including the elimination of low-level corruption, the restructuring of police forces, and significant improvements in public services. The new government's anti-corruption drive was so successful that traffic police who had previously extorted bribes from every motorist were replaced by well-paid officers who actually enforced traffic laws rather than personal enrichment schemes. However, Saakashvili's greatest ambition was the restoration of Georgia's territorial integrity through the reintegration of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This goal required either negotiated settlement with separatist authorities or military action to restore Georgian control, and the president's temperament made him poorly suited for the patient diplomacy that negotiated solutions typically require. His Western education had taught him about rapid institutional reform, but not about the complexities of ethnic reconciliation. The build-up to the 2008 war reflected Saakashvili's belief that rapid modernization could create facts on the ground that would force separatist regions to accept reintegration with a transformed Georgia. His government invested heavily in military modernization, trained with NATO advisors, and pursued policies designed to demonstrate that democratic Georgia offered better prospects than Russian-sponsored pseudo-states. Unfortunately, this approach ignored Russian strategic interests and Vladimir Putin's determination to prevent Georgia's integration with Western security structures. Russia had spent years building relationships with separatist authorities, distributing Russian passports to residents of occupied territories, and creating economic dependencies that tied South Ossetia and Abkhazia to Russian systems rather than Georgian ones. The war that erupted in August 2008 was brief but decisive, lasting only 5 days but fundamentally altering the geopolitical balance in the South Caucasus. Georgian forces initially achieved tactical success in South Ossetia, but were quickly overwhelmed by Russian military intervention that demonstrated the vast gap between Georgian capabilities and Russian power projection in the region. The conflict displaced nearly 200,000 people, most of them ethnic Georgians forced to flee areas that came under Russian or separatist control. The war also revealed the limitations of Western support for Georgia. While NATO countries provided diplomatic backing and humanitarian assistance, they were unwilling to risk military confrontation with Russia over Georgian territorial integrity. Russian recognition of South Ossetian and Abkhazian independence following the war created a new reality that effectively partitioned Georgia while maintaining the fiction of territorial integrity. The occupied territories became Russian protectorates in everything but name, hosting Russian military bases and operating under Russian economic systems while maintaining nominal independence that no major power except Russia recognized. The war's aftermath marked the end of Saakashvili's political dominance and the beginning of a more cautious approach to Russian relations. Georgians gradually recognized that their geographic location required accommodation with Russian interests, regardless of their preferences for Western integration. The dream of rapid modernization and territorial restoration had collided with the reality of great power politics in ways that made romantic nationalism seem like a luxury the country could not afford. The European Union's response to the conflict included increased economic assistance and eventual negotiation of an association agreement that offered Georgia closer integration with European markets. This represented a significant achievement for Georgian diplomacy, providing concrete benefits from Western relationships while avoiding military commitments that NATO membership would have entailed. The period following the war also saw important developments in Georgian democracy, including peaceful transitions of power through electoral processes that showed the country's institutions had achieved genuine stability. The Georgian Dream Coalition's victory in 2012 marked the first time in Georgian history that an opposition party had come to power through free elections rather than revolution. The legacy of Georgia's independence struggle reveals both the possibilities and limitations of small nation self-determination in the contemporary world. Georgians successfully overthrew Soviet rule, created democratic institutions, and modernized their economy, but they also discovered that independence does not guarantee security or sovereignty when larger neighbors possess both the capability and the inclination to intervene in domestic affairs. Perhaps the most significant achievement of the independence period was the preservation of Georgian national identity, despite multiple crises that could have led to state collapse or absorption by more powerful neighbors. Through civil wars, ethnic conflicts, state failure, and international intervention, Georgians maintained their commitment to distinct cultural and political identity while adapting their strategies to accommodate changing circumstances. As we approach the present day, Georgia remains caught between competing influences and uncertain about its ultimate destination. But the country has survived challenges that would have destroyed less resilient societies. The next chapter of Georgian history will be determined by how successfully Georgians balance their European aspirations with the geopolitical realities of their neighborhood, a challenge that requires both courage and wisdom in equal measure. Chapter 6: Modern Georgia: Wine, Mountains, and Geopolitics. The 21st century has transformed Georgia from a struggling post-Soviet state into one of the world's most intriguing travel destinations, combining ancient traditions with contemporary innovations in ways that would have astonished previous generations. Modern Georgia represents a fascinating synthesis of Europe and Asia, democracy and tradition, global connectivity, and local authenticity that has captivated visitors from around the world while maintaining the distinctive character that has defined Georgian civilization for millennia. The country's tourism industry has become a genuine economic success story, generating over $4 billion annually and positioning Georgia among the world's fastest-growing tourism markets. This remarkable achievement reflects not only the country's natural beauty and cultural richness, but also deliberate policy decisions that have made Georgia one of the most accessible destinations for international travelers, with visa-free access for citizens of 98 countries. Wine tourism has emerged as Georgia's most distinctive attraction, drawing visitors eager to experience the world's oldest winemaking tradition in its original setting. The ancient Kuvevri method of fermenting wine in underground clay vessels, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage, offers something that simply cannot be replicated anywhere else on Earth. Georgian wineries have successfully combined 8,000-year-old techniques with modern hospitality infrastructure, creating experiences that satisfy both wine connoisseurs and cultural tourists. The Kakheti region has become the heart of Georgian wine tourism, with vineyards stretching across rolling hills that seem designed specifically for Instagram photography. Visitors can participate in traditional harvest festivals, learn ancient winemaking techniques, and taste varieties of grapes that exist nowhere else in the world. The experience combines education, entertainment, and gastronomy in ways that create lasting memories and encourage repeat visits. Georgian cuisine has gained international recognition as one of the world's great food traditions, featuring unique flavor combinations and cooking techniques that reflect the country's position at the crossroads of European and Asian culinary influences. Khachapuri, khinkali, and other traditional dishes have become known far beyond Georgia's borders, while contemporary Georgian chefs have begun experimenting with fusion approaches that honor traditional ingredients while appealing to international palates. The country's natural landscapes provide opportunities for adventure tourism that range from hiking in the Caucasus Mountains to exploring the caves of Vardzia and swimming in the Black Sea. Upper Svaneti, with its medieval defensive towers and dramatic mountain scenery, offers trekking experiences that combine physical challenge with cultural immersion. The region's UNESCO World Heritage designation has helped protect its unique character while encouraging sustainable tourism development. Tbilisi has transformed itself into a regional, cultural and economic hub that successfully balances historical preservation with contemporary development. The city's Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage candidate, showcases architectural styles that span 15 centuries, while new districts feature modern infrastructure and international businesses. The famous sulfur baths that gave Tbilisi its name continue to operate alongside boutique hotels and contemporary art galleries. The capital's nightlife and restaurant scene have earned international recognition, with establishments that cater to both traditional Georgian tastes and international visitors seeking authentic experiences. Tbilisi's reputation as a creative center has attracted artists, writers, and entrepreneurs from throughout the region, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that coexists comfortably with deep-rooted Georgian traditions. Georgia's film industry has experienced remarkable growth, taking advantage of the country's diverse landscapes and competitive production costs to attract international projects. The government's film-friendly policies and investment in infrastructure have made Georgia an increasingly popular destination for both Hollywood productions and independent filmmakers seeking dramatic backdrops and professional services at affordable prices. However, contemporary Georgia remains caught between competing geopolitical influences that create both opportunities and challenges for its future development. The country's aspirations for European Union membership reflect widespread popular support for Western integration, with polling consistently showing that nearly 80% of Georgians favor EU accession. This preference represents not just political calculation but cultural affinity with European values of democracy, rule of law, and individual freedom. The European Union granted Georgia candidate status in December 2023, marking a significant milestone in the country's European integration process. This achievement came after years of institutional reforms and alignment with EU standards, demonstrating Georgia's commitment to European values despite significant external pressures. The candidacy provides a framework for continued modernization while offering concrete benefits in terms of trade, investment, and institutional development. Yet Georgia's path toward European integration faces significant obstacles from both internal political dynamics and external geopolitical pressures. The ruling Georgian Dream Party has increasingly adopted positions that conflict with EU expectations, including passage of a foreign agents law similar to Russian legislation and rhetorical attacks on Western organizations. These developments have strained relationships with Brussels and Washington while raising questions about the government's genuine commitment to European integration. Russian influence remains a persistent factor in Georgian politics, exercised through multiple channels that include economic relationships, information campaigns, and direct political interference. Moscow's occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia serves as a constant reminder of Russian military capabilities while demonstrating the limits of Western security guarantees. The ongoing territorial disputes create permanent vulnerabilities that Russian policymakers can exploit when Georgian policies displease Moscow. The rise of China as a major economic partner has added another dimension to Georgia's geopolitical challenges, with Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative offering infrastructure investment and trade opportunities that come with their own political implications. Georgia's strategic location along the middle corridor connecting China to Europe makes the country valuable to Chinese planners seeking alternatives to traditional trade routes, but this attention also creates new dependencies and complications for Georgian foreign policy. Recent political developments have created the most serious crisis in Georgia's European trajectory since independence, with the government's decision to suspend EU accession negotiations until 2028, triggering massive protests throughout the country. These demonstrations reflect the deep divide between popular aspirations for European integration and government policies that seem designed to align Georgia with authoritarian alternatives to Western partnerships. The ongoing political crisis reveals fundamental tensions about Georgia's future direction and identity. Younger generations who have grown up with democratic institutions and European connections view EU membership as their natural destiny, while some political leaders apparently calculate that accommodation with Russia and China offers better prospects for maintaining power and economic development. Despite these political uncertainties, Georgian civil society has demonstrated remarkable resilience and sophistication in defending democratic values and European aspirations. The youth movement that has organized recent protests shows organizational capabilities and strategic thinking that would impress political professionals anywhere in the world. These activists represent continuity with the traditions of resistance and adaptation that have enabled Georgian survival through previous historical challenges. Georgian culture continues to evolve in ways that blend traditional elements with contemporary influences, creating art, literature, and music that speaks to both local and international audiences. The country's UNESCO-recognized polyphonic singing tradition thrives alongside modern musical experimentation, while Georgian artists increasingly participate in global cultural conversations while drawing inspiration from their distinctive heritage. The preservation of Georgian architectural heritage has become a sophisticated enterprise that balances conservation requirements with contemporary development needs. Tbilisi's historic districts showcase successful examples of adaptive reuse that maintain historical character while accommodating modern functions. The city's architectural evolution reflects broader themes of continuity and change that characterize contemporary Georgian society. The famous sulfur baths of Abanotubani continue to operate much as they have for centuries, providing therapeutic treatments that attract both locals and visitors seeking authentic wellness experiences. These ancient facilities have been carefully restored to meet contemporary hygiene and safety standards, while preserving their distinctive architectural character and traditional treatment methods that connect modern users with centuries of Georgian spa culture. Georgia's emergence as a regional technology hub has surprised many observers who associate the country primarily with wine and mountains rather than digital innovation. Tbilisi has attracted significant investment in software development, e-commerce, and financial technology, with government policies that encourage foreign investment and entrepreneurship. The country's excellent internet infrastructure and educated workforce have made it an attractive destination for international companies seeking cost-effective development centers. Educational reforms have transformed Georgian universities into institutions that increasingly meet international standards while preserving distinctive Georgian approaches to learning and research. International partnerships with European and American universities have created exchange programs that expose Georgian students to global perspectives while attracting foreign students interested in experiencing unique cultural and academic environments. The country's healthcare system has undergone significant modernization, with new hospitals and clinics that provide services comparable to those available in much wealthier countries. Medical tourism has emerged as a growing industry, with patients from neighboring countries seeking high-quality treatments at affordable prices in facilities that combine modern medical technology with traditional Georgian hospitality. Georgian language and literature continue to flourish, despite the small size of the global Georgian-speaking population, with contemporary writers gaining international recognition while contributing to ongoing conversations about Georgian identity and values. The three writing systems of Georgian alphabet, recognized by UNESCO, remain vital parts of contemporary culture rather than merely historical artifacts. Contemporary Georgian cinema has gained international recognition through films that explore themes of tradition and modernity, displacement and belonging, with directors like Nana Ekvtimishvili and Simon Gross creating works that resonate with global audiences while remaining distinctively Georgian in perspective and sensibility. These achievements reflect broader cultural confidence that enables Georgian artists to engage with universal themes through particular Georgian experiences. Sports have provided another avenue for Georgia to gain international recognition, with Georgian athletes achieving success in rugby, wrestling, judo, and other competitions that bring positive attention to the country. The national rugby team's impressive performances have made the sport increasingly popular among young Georgians, while creating international recognition for Georgian athletic capabilities and competitive spirit. Religious life remains central to Georgian society, with the Georgian Orthodox Church maintaining its traditional role while adapting to contemporary circumstances. Ancient monasteries continue to attract both pilgrims and tourists, while new churches incorporate traditional architectural elements in ways that demonstrate the ongoing vitality of Georgian spiritual traditions. The Church's influence on social and political life reflects deep cultural continuities, while sometimes creating tensions with secular governance. Environmental conservation has become an increasingly important priority, with national parks and protected areas that preserve Georgia's remarkable biodiversity while providing opportunities for sustainable tourism. The government has invested in renewable energy projects that take advantage of Georgia's substantial hydroelectric potential, while reducing dependence on fossil fuel imports. These initiatives reflect growing environmental awareness, while creating economic opportunities in green technology sectors. Economic development has proceeded unevenly but impressively in many sectors, with Georgia achieving significant improvements in infrastructure, business climate, and institutional quality since the early 2000s. The country consistently ranks among the easiest places to do business in the world, while its banking system and telecommunications infrastructure meet European standards. These achievements provide foundation for continued growth regardless of political uncertainties. The future of modern Georgia will likely depend on how successfully the country manages to balance competing pressures while maintaining the essential characteristics that make it distinctive. Geography and history have given Georgians extensive experience in navigating between great powers while preserving cultural identity, and these skills remain relevant in contemporary circumstances that echo ancient challenges in modern forms. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of contemporary Georgia is how successfully the country has maintained its appeal to visitors while dealing with serious political and security challenges. Tourists continue to arrive in record numbers, attracted by experiences that combine safety, authenticity, and value in ways that few destinations can match. This resilience suggests that Georgia's fundamental attractions transcend temporary political difficulties. As we reach the end of our journey through Georgian history and geography, the enduring themes become clear. This is a country that has survived and thrived through adaptation, creativity, and an unshakable commitment to cultural identity. Whether facing Persian emperors, Russian czars, Soviet commissars, or contemporary geopolitical pressures, Georgians have consistently found ways to preserve what matters most while adjusting to changing circumstances. Modern Georgia stands as a testament to the possibility of maintaining ancient traditions while embracing contemporary opportunities, offering lessons for small nations everywhere about how to navigate an increasingly complex world. The country's wine flows as it has for 8 millennia, its mountains rise as they always have, and its people continue the eternal Georgian project of creating meaning and beauty from the raw materials of history and geography. In this timeless enterprise, Georgia remains undefeated and eternally hopeful about tomorrow's possibilities.